It's such a pleasure and delight to welcome you to this very important occasion and event at the Azrieli Institute of Israel Studies. I want to make sure that we mention the generosity of the Department of Political Science that has lent us its technology as well as the space of this beautiful seminar room, where we are able to mark the occasion of the presentation of our second Best Book Award for Israel Studies. My name is Csaba Nikolényi. I'm Professor of Political Science and also Director of the Azrieli Institute of Israel Studies. And it's truly wonderful to be able to welcome to this event very important representatives of the Faculty of Arts and Science, Concordia University Library, and of course, the winner of this year's competition, Professor Shay Hazkani. Before I would say a few words about the award itself and the history of the award, the mandate of the award, I would like to turn, if not the floor, but certainly the screen, over to my colleague and friend, Dr. Elizabeth Blockwood, who is Associate Dean of Faculty Affairs and Inclusion at the Faculty of Arts and Science, asking her to offer a few preliminary greetings and remarks. Then we will turn it over to Pat Riva, who is representing the librarian at Concordia University Library, who will offer her greetings and remarks on behalf of the library, which is one of the co-sponsors of the award itself. And then I will introduce our speaker as well as the award. And then we would like to treat you to a very special informal conversation with Professor Hazkani about the book that earned him this prestigious prize. So without further ado, Beth, let me turn the floor, the table, and the screen over to you.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. The Faculty of Arts and Sciences is proud to be the home of the Azrieli Institute for Israeli Studies. The Institute is the first in Canada and Quebec, and is a significant site of multidisciplinary research and education. It is incredibly active in its research and its support of student success through experiential learning opportunities, such as the summer school that goes to Israel, as well as sort of fantastic partnerships with community institutions and financial support for students. I believe it is a shining example of what the Faculty of Arts and Sciences and Concordia are all about, working together across disciplines in order to foster lasting, meaningful understanding for the benefit of society. The Best Book in Israeli Studies award is one of the many ways that the Institute has supported research in Israeli studies, and it builds upon its reputation for high caliber research affiliates and postdoctoral fellows. My heartfelt congratulations to Dr. Shay Hazkani for his book, Dear Palestine, A Social History of the 1948 War. His use of the accounts of everyday people to provide a more complex understanding of important political events with transnational implications aligns very well with the multifaceted, multidisciplinary approach of the Israeli Institute. So thank you very much and congratulations.
Thank you very much, Beth, for those very important and kind remarks. And now let's turn to Pat Riva, the university librarian, who will offer her remarks from on behalf of the library.
Yes, hello everyone. I'm really happy that the library is a co-sponsor of this award with the Azrieli Institute. I think it's a wonderful initiative to have a Best Book in Israel Studies award, and it's also very suitable for Concordia Library in particular. We have long supported the Azrieli Institute, and we also hold the Israeli Holocaust Collection, which was established by a generous endowment back in 1984 by David J. Azrieli, who also, of course, is the founder and sponsor, original impetus behind having an Azrieli Institute. And so over the years, this collection has grown, and it's one of the most important specialized collections in North America that covers scholarly research and teaching on the Holocaust, the history of anti-Semitism, and a host of connected subjects. It is both in special collections with rare and specialized items, but also a general collection, borrowable collection. And at this point is getting close to 10,000 items in this collection that have come. So that is a very important, I think, resource for research and scholarship at Concordia on this subject. And so the library was delighted to become a co-sponsor for this book prize. And my colleague Jeffrey Little, who is on sabbatical this year, and that's why he's not with us today, was on the selection committee this past year, and the library always participates in the selection committee. And of course, we're always delighted to see the interesting and important books that come out of this process. And so we welcome Professor Hazkani to this, and are delighted, as I say, to be part of this initiative. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Beth. And with your permission, let me now introduce with a few words the award, present the award, if you will, to Shay, to Professor Hazkani, and then engage him in a brief conversation that should tease everyone here in the room, as well as on the screen through Zoom to this very important work. So the idea of the book award actually is as old, and the practice of giving out and presenting the book award in Israel studies is almost as old as the institute itself, which was established in the year 2011. Now, for the first several years, the book award that we presented was in partnership with the Montreal Jewish Public Library. And the recipient of the award, which at that time used to be given out every 2 years, included the late Boaz Neumann, Anita Shapira, Hillel Cohen, and Noam Zadov. And then when the Jewish Public Library revamped its award programs, we decided in a very amicable sense to part ways. And it was at that point that together and under the leadership of Jeffrey Little, whom Pat just mentioned, the University Library and the Azrieli Institute decided to join hands to make sure that this important tradition of celebrating and marking most important recent major contributions to the field of Israel studies would continue. And so last year was the first year that we established an award committee, a jury committee, and that we awarded the prize. Last year there were 2 recipients, Inbal Ben Asher Gitler from Sapir College, and Hagai Ram from Ben-Gurion University of the Negev were the recipients of the prize. And today, this year, we are truly delighted to announce that the jury committee decided unanimously and enthusiastically to award the 2nd annual Best Book Award to Shay Hazkani's book, Dear Palestine. It's important that I should mention that this year's jury committee included four representatives. As Pat mentioned, Jeffrey Little on behalf of the University Library. We had 2 professors, researchers representing the field of Israel studies, Maya Balakirsky-Katz, who is a scholar of Israeli fine arts from Bar-Ilan University, and Noam Zadov, an Israeli historian or historian of Israel from the University of Innsbruck. And I was in representing the Azrieli Institute, the 4th member of the jury committee. And to make sure that you don't think that we are just talking about the award, I would like to actually present Shay with a small plaquable, if you will, a certificate to commemorate this important occasion and this important visit. Shay, we are truly delighted that you accepted our invitation and that we can actually present the award to you, not just through Zoom, which was the case last year, but actually in person. So without further ado, let me invite you, Shay, and maybe the 3 of us can even talk or can be comfortable to come in a short conversation about what this book is really about, what you sought to accomplish with it, and what has been the reception, the impact, because let me tease those members of the audience who may not know, this book actually became the foundation for a very important and very well-received documentary. But more about that from Shay. Shay, please take us back to the very beginning. You're an Israeli historian, and Israeli history is complex. You could have searched for and you could have found so many complicated, complex parts of the story, of the history of the nation to that. Why this and why this particular way?
So first of all, thank you so much, Shava. I'm really excited to be here in Montreal and for this honor of the Azrieli and the Concordia Library Book Award. So it's a great pleasure to be here with you. And thank you so much for hosting me. So it's actually interesting because today marks exactly 2 years since the book came out, literally to the day, the 21st of April, came out by Stanford University Press. It was still the sort of days of the pandemic, so it was a very odd book release. And I was really, really fortunate that the book received a good amount of interest, also some anger, and we can talk about some of those responses as well in our conversation. And the story really goes back, yesterday I told you that I have a little bit of a dark past in journalism. And I told you that, historians at risk when I started in the profession, they didn't always tell and admit to the fact that they used to be journalists. But, I told you that I'm having second thoughts about that sort of hiding of that part in my past. And today I'm much more open about it. And this story of Deep Palestine actually starts when I was still a journalist. I was a West Bank and a military correspondent in Israeli TV, a very naive one. There are a lot of reporting that I really regret, almost 20 years later. And in a day in 2006 or 7, I was in the archives of Israel Defense Forces. These are very peculiar archives. They're essentially a military compound, not the most comfortable place to be sitting and doing research. And I was there actually still as a TV correspondent, sifting through some documents. I wanted to do something about Israel's first arms deal with West Germany in the 50s, brought up a lot of emotions because, of course, Israel was selling weapons to Germany just a few years after the extermination of European Jews. And I was sifting through documents, not the most exciting documents there are. And suddenly I found this one document which said, one army bureaucrat officer saying to another, by the way, if you want to know what soldiers are saying in their personal ledgers back home about the arms deal with Germany, I refer you to this document we publish every 2 weeks called The Soldier's Opinion. And I was very much intrigued. What is this? I went to the archivist. I was like, can I see the soldier's opinion? And he's like, well, no, yes. And we talked a little bit about me working on these struggles with the archives, including taking them to court. So it took many, many years, but eventually I was allowed to see that source. These are intelligence documents produced every 2 weeks called The Soldier's Opinion that include the intercepted letters of these people, not to spy on an individual, but rather to get to the state of mind of these population in general. So this was done to Israeli Jewish soldiers coming from all over the world, right? Mizrahi, Ashkenazi, and others, to Palestinians, including those who were expelled in 48 and ended up in refugee camps and corresponded with their families, and many, many others. So a really rich source for a historian to know what, ordinary people think and what they made of the war. And I remember looking through these lectures at the archives. I was still a reporter and, really being just enchanted and also angry because the letters and the stories in them were really different than the ones that, everyone growing up in Israel with a nationalistic education system learns about the war in 48. And, I remember reading this letter of a soldier, actually from the early 60s, who was sent to demolish a depopulated Palestinian village. This was a very common thing. The villages, over 500 of them were conquered in 48. Many of the inhabitants were expelled, but the villages themselves were only demolished in the 60s. And he walks around the village and he has this aha moment where he basically, suddenly had this feeling of an intense connection with the people who live there. And he started asking himself, not himself, right? He writes to his loved one or his parents' home. I suddenly realized, the soldier writes, and I end the book with that letter, that people lived here, they loved, they hated, and he wonders where they were at this particular moment. And I was reading this letter, and it was just really surprising me to find that. And that was one of the first letters that I literally accidentally came across. And there's something with those sources, it took me almost 15 years to actually make sense of them, but that was really, really drawing. I think it tells a very different story about something that many people think they already know. And so that's what sort of drew me to this project. It took a very long time to figure out what to do with these sort of sources. But that's, I think, what really drew me to them.
Shay, approximately how many such letters did you go through to write this book? And what linguistic skills, what was your linguistic repertoire that you had to deploy and employ in order to make sense of them, understand them, classify them, and so forth?
So these intelligence reports that were sent to the, Ben-Gurions and some of the higher echelons of the, the Zionist organization and the Israeli state were produced every 2 weeks, right, on an array of topics, right? So every 2 weeks, this apparatus called the Postal Military Censorship, which is, of course, a British apparatus, right? The British created all around the world. They have one in Palestine. And when they leave in Mir 48, they literally hand the keys to the Jews. And so that's how it exists. Otherwise, it would have probably not existed already in 1948. And so you have an unbelievable amount of those, letters and sources. Many of them are not necessarily on topics that I was very interested in. It's just, it varies, right? You have letters of reporters coming to Israel to report about the war that were intercepted secretly without those writers knowing. And so, it was a lot of sifting through these unbelievable amount of letter, right? For the 48, 49 period, certainly, in the thousands. And then I was also fortunate, and I looked for it for many years, to locate letters of Arab volunteers coming from all over the Arab world, joining a volunteer army called the Arab Liberation Army in 48 to fight and help Palestinians, right? This was a solidarity movement, and those letters were actually in their handwritten Arabic. It was very challenging to decipher, and I was really fortunate to have the help of some research assistants and all around the Arab world could help me. It's not just reading the Arabic that I could do, but sort of understanding the local context of someone writing in Baghdad, in a certain area of Baghdad in 48, and some of what they're talking about, right? Because when someone writes a letter, they assume the recipient knows what they're talking about. They don't need the footnotes, right? So that was often challenging, but it was really, really important to me for this project.
Shay, what would you say some of the greatest methodological challenges or other challenges were that you faced during the realization of this project?
There were quite a few of those. I knew that these letters were really, quote unquote, cool, but what to do with them, right? And how to tell them in a story that has a beginning and a middle of it and an end was very challenging. I wrote this obviously, or not obviously, but also as a PhD dissertation. That's one that most people could probably not read because they would find incredibly boring. But the editor at Stanford Press, Kate Wall, she's extremely talented, and she had some brilliant ideas. She said, this is a great project, but this is not written as a book. So why don't you make this into an actual book that people can read, and not just academics? In fact, I didn't really write this for academics. The idea was that people, not, I guess, everyone, but could actually make sense of that. So that was very challenging. Now, making sense of those personal letters, which are not necessarily a reflection of, quote unquote, what really happened, which people are really interested in. And I understand that it's a part of the project. But what I'm interested in is what sense ordinary people made of what happened, right? What were their visceral reactions to seeing, the immense violence, the depopulation, the changes, right? I mean, this is a revolution in some ways in Jewish history. It's also the end of the Arab Palestine and its erasure. So what sense people made of those monumental events in real time? It is not a romantic, flowery story. It is sometimes a sad, heartbreaking story with immense violence and immense reflection of, what does it mean to be Jewish in the national era? What changes that brings to Jewish tradition? And so all these stories are sort of included in this project.
Shay, was there for you an aha moment during the project, during the research, or was there a particular character, a particular letter, a particular micro instance of anything that you found that stayed with you You started, the book came out 2 years ago. You've been busy teaching, researching on a host of other subjects. Is there something that you carry with yourself?
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of these, and you know, I actually, so the letters themselves, as they are reproduced in these intelligence reports, they often don't include the names of the authors. We know something about their ethnic background, we know the language they're writing, and what I ended up doing in the book, I named all these letter writers, and I used Israel name registry from the period to know what were common names for people of certain ethnicity, of a certain year, etc. And you know, a lot of these letters are, have stayed with me in fun, important ways. There's a letter by a female combat soldier. They existed in 1948 that witnesses some really atrocious and really awful war crimes in the context of the occupation of the Galilee, and reports about them to her family, including burning of POWs, really challenging and awful stories, and that makes her reflect about what does it mean, this transformation of what she sees Judaism, whatever that may mean, into a national era. And she talks about this question of this struggle, right, that starts as early as Zionism, between this idea of Jews being like all other nations, and that should be like all other nations, including establishing a military force, including potentially taking pleasure in violence, or should Jews be light on to nation, right? And that was also an idea prevalent in early Zionism, and sort of reject what some saw as a Gentile way of war, etc. And so you see those debates and discussions, sometimes very painful way, in those letters, and these were just fascinating. There's also a lot of letters by these Moroccan Jews that come to Israel to volunteer in 48, and discover that there's a lot of racism, right? As many see them as Arab Jews or something like that, and that makes things very, very challenging for them, and makes them themselves think about their connection to Arabness. What does it mean that they are Arabic-speaking Jews? What are all these things that come together in this explosive moment of 1948? There is a lot of these really, really interesting letters that obviously have stayed with me for working on this for so long, for so many years.
Shay, before we turn it over to the audience for their engagement, let me just shift gears and ask you about reactions to and reception of the book. Now, at the beginning, you mentioned the word anger. Who was angry? And did you anticipate that?
Yeah. First of all, I was born and raised in Israel, and I'm okay with a good raucous, no problem there. The story. And what I hope to do as a historian is really tell stories that people think they're familiar with, but are actually told in new ways. And so the book starts with this Iraqi Jew that actually fights for the Arab side in 1948 and fights against other Jews, right? Something that you can never imagine, ever. And he talks about, his experience and how that came about. And obviously that is a rare instance, but it just tells you that, the assumption today that things have always been like they are today, and that, conceptions and ideas about Israel, Palestine, quote unquote, the conflict were always the same, that is a false conception, right? And in 48, there was much more fluidity in what it meant to be Arab, to be Jewish, what those were the lines of division between these. So the book looks at these letters, but what it also does, it looks at propaganda. Both propaganda that was disseminated by the Israeli state, by education officers in the Israel Defense Forces, and also propaganda disseminated by the Arab League and some of the Arab fighting forces in Palestine. Someone grew up in Israel, and many who grew up elsewhere would be very familiar with this claimed that Arab propaganda in 1948, one of its major ideas was about, quote unquote, throwing Jews into the sea. Very, very common in Israeli textbooks, study books, and I think this was also popularized as a claim in a very famous novel by Leon Uris, Exodus, that came out in 1959. So one of the things I was really interested in, I read Arabic, and half of the book is with Arabic sources, and I've sifted through hundreds of these sources in Arabic that were used to indoctrinate and educate Palestinian fighters and Arab volunteers in war, looking whether or not this was a main theme of propaganda in the war. Story is a bit more complicated, but I did not find that as a main theme. What I did find is that Israeli leaders, including Ben-Gurion, already during the war said that that was the Arab aim, right? That this was a second Holocaust, although the term Holocaust did not really exist at the time, but an attempt to sort of exterminate the Jewish state. And, you know, that's something I talk about in the book. Now, again, it's not that the propaganda is a peaceful propaganda. This is war, there are war crimes, it's a complicated story. But whether this was a main theme in Arab propaganda is something that I looked at and I wrote about in the book. And, you know, these books, this is an academic book, and, you know, in the Israeli context, you know, Haaretz would take interest, etc. But I was, for better or worse, drew the attention of a columnist in a newspaper known as Yediot Ahronoth, which is essentially an Israeli tabloid, right? A very popular one, much more popular than the sort of broadsheet newspapers. And that columnist, you know, spent a good amount of time writing what we would probably call a hit piece about the book and me personally in the context of whether or not the Palestinians and Arabs called to throw the Jews into the sea. And, you know, I saw it as an actual opportunity. He wrote this column, you know, not the language that I use, but I know that this is the discourse that is prevalent in our days. And, you know, I contacted the editor of the newspaper, you know, this famous columnist, who absolutely do not work on these issues, had written this hit piece. I would want to respond. Now, 1948, right, is obviously one of the taboo issues in Israel. It does not make it to Yediot Ahronoth, right? And it makes it into Haaretz, but not as much to. And so that was an interesting opportunity, and he let me publish a short response to this, which, you know, I sort of put aside all the sort of personal language and sort of hit piece version parts of that piece, and I focused on, you know, talking to readers. You know, you think you are very familiar with what is 48 and what took place there, but there was actually, I think, some new things, some new ideas, some new information, some new narratives that are maybe worth looking at. And I sent it to look somewhere else in the website, etc. So that was an interesting opportunity. Certainly, as I mentioned, you know, it drew. I was really fortunate to have many reviews, over 20 reviews published on this, and the book will come out in Hebrew in the summer. But certainly, you know, old ideas are very hard to forego, and old myths are. And, you know, that's something that came across a lot in this as well.
Shay, can you say a few words about the film?
Yeah. So, you know, it was really, really important to me to try and make some of the findings of this project accessible to those who may not, you know, read academic books or of that sort. I was really fortunate that the director, Asaf Banit, a filmmaker in Israel, had found quite a few years ago in 2013, a piece I'd written in a newspaper with some initial findings of this project. And he thought it was a really interesting idea, and he wanted to make a documentary. And, you know, I told him, that sounds like a great idea, but I'm not going to just, you know, give the information to you and for you to make a documentary. We will have to do this together. I don't know, we need to ask him whether you regret that, because a historian and a filmmaker making a film is a good start of a good joke. You know, walk into a pub and, you know, what happens later? Well, it gets challenging because the filmmaker knows how to make film, and he wants to make this into a film that, you know, people would want to watch, that has a story, that is, you know, an hour film. A historian, you know, I was, you know, in the book, I have trying to remember, about 600 letters cited. And it was like, all right, well, I understand you can have 600, but then let's have 300. And he was like, all right, and well, let's do 12, or let's do, and you know, it was a long process to make that. It was a commercial production by Israel Cable Network. It's very different. It's its own sort of creation. Obviously, you know, book has a much more sort of didactic value to it and can go into much more details, etc. But in an interesting way, it focuses on that story of the postal censorship that intercepted these letters, and from there goes to the stories of the letters themselves. It was aired on, you know, we got some ratings, right, from a piece that was aired about it on the film in Israeli broadcast channel. It had like 128,000 viewers. Now, how many people would read the book? 1,000, 2,000, I don't know, but not 120,000. And so, you know, it's an opportunity. And you know, what I hope, although I don't know that's how life actually works, is that, you know, people may find this somewhat interesting and they will go and search for something else that may be out there. My work, someone else's work that, you know, tells a more complicated story about, you know, Israel, Palestine, and very sad reality in which we are today.
Thank you, Shay. Now, in this moment, let me first offer an opportunity to our friends and colleagues here in the seminar room to see if there are any questions, comments. Just looking around, if anybody has a comment, a question. If not, we can certainly come back in a few minutes. With Corey's help, let's see if there are any comments, questions. We are on the Zoom. Corey, would you mind sharing the question?
We actually have someone who wants to ask with their hand.
It's all in your hands. So.
All right.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Can I talk to you? Can you hear me?
We can hear you very well. Yes, please, go ahead.
This is Yolande Cohen. Thank you very much for your presentation. I'm very happy to hear all what you have to say about this. And unfortunately, I didn't read your book, but I will. You mentioned the letters of Moroccan Jews. My family had immigrated in 48 in Israel, and they were sending signs that everything was going wrong for them. But we don't have much letters from them. And they were, of course, with families, young children, and they probably were engaged within the war. And I was wondering, which kind of letters did you find, and can you speak a little bit more about what was their feeling? Thank you.
Thank you so much for this question. Yes, this is something that the book really looks at in depth. And in fact, my next research project look exclusively at these Moroccan Jews. It will come out as an article in Jewish Social Studies in a month or so. So this group of Moroccan Jews was a fascinating group, about 1,500 or so soldiers. Moroccan soldiers actually served in the IDF in 48, 49 out of a group of about 20,000 immigrants who came to Israel during that period. That group, in the eyes of the Israeli leadership, was very, very problematic because, and they were the target of a very sustained and comprehensive surveillance apparatus against them. The reason is that many of them initially, as they came to Israel, they saw the creation of the State of Israel, and including Jews taking up arms in Israel as a potential sort of fundamental change in the dynamics of, you know, the dhimmi status, right? The status of Jews that were still relevant to a degree, even in modern Morocco. It wasn't so in the rest of the Arab world, but in Morocco itself, Jews were still sort of regarded by the Moroccan Sultan as sort of having this protected status. And so initially, the creation of the State of Israel and Israel's victory in the war was seen as something that was very exciting for them. However, within a very short period of time, from the end of 48 until the end of 49, many of these new immigrants and soldiers experienced pretty severe racism in Israel, which comes to be depicted in those letters, right? I mean, really just heartbreaking kind of racism, primarily by the majority of Ashkenazi Jews. They talk about that a lot, that in their personal letters. And those personal letters were a main interest to the Israeli security apparatus and to Ben-Gurion himself. In fact, that postal censorship bureau that copied these letters published many reports throughout 49 and into the 50s only about these Moroccan Jews. And in these reports, for example, from 1949, they showed that about 70% of those soldiers and immigrants that were not soldiers of Morocco, not descent, that came from Morocco in those years, actually wanted to leave Israel and return to Morocco, which was a major shock for the Israeli leadership at the time, and caused all sorts of attempts to sort of change those perceptions and even change the letters going to Morocco so they would not depict Israel in a negative light. Now, my new research project that will come out looks at these Moroccan Jews all the way from 1949 to 1959. In 1959, there was as you may know, a revolt in Israel known as the Wadi Salib revolt, which was essentially a revolt against Ashkenazi hegemony and Ben-Gurion's Mapai party. And what I do is that I follow the story of these Moroccan Jews using their personal letters that they sent to their families in Morocco, but also the letters sent from family in Morocco that was also intercepted by the Israeli intelligence apparatus. And so I look at this, right? So after 1954 with Moroccan independence, after 1956 with Moroccan independence, return to Morocco is no longer an option. And so what we see is sort of a shift in the resistance of Moroccan Jews in Israel to racism, where that shift is what I argue results in the revolt of 1959. And what the letters show, and I'll end with that, is a really interesting process that I term the radicalization of Morocco. It shows that Moroccans in Israel actually took heed and took sought to imitate some of the anti-colonial revolt against the French in Morocco. By literally, in those letters, you see, the Moroccans in Israel in 59 in Haifa and Wadi Salib, learned from the Moroccan Arabs. They staged this massive militant revolt, tried to overthrow the regime, etc. Very interesting sort of cross-fertilization with what is going on in Morocco and elsewhere in North Africa at that time. And so that's the next project that sort of takes off from where the book leaves.
Thank you.
There is a cousin of mine that you could interview in Israel that had been participating in the Wadi Salib revolt, Moshe Cohen. He has been writing already around it. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Yolanda. Thank you. Corey, any other comments, questions? And we have a question from the audience, please.
Shay, one question. So your research in the book and all they came from the letters and the documents you found. Actually, she was asking it before, like, did you have a chance to interview anyone? Or I know they're supposed to be pretty old now, but did you meet anyone, family, or something like that?
Thank you so much for this question. I did not, for the most part, the writers, we don't have their names, so it was very challenging to look at them. But when we did interview, I interviewed some of those officers that were engaged in the intelligence and the collecting of those letters. I interviewed some of them for the book, but then, of course, in the film, we had the opportunity of interviewing several dozens of them and sort of get the sense of, what they were interested in, what they were doing, how they saw what they were doing, this sort of big brother apparatus. And so these people are ones that we interviewed a lot. But for this project, at least, I did not interview individuals who wrote letters, even in the cases that I thought I could possibly identify them. Maybe it's just sort of the conservative training of a historian, but in my future project, I hope to do much more extensive oral interviews and sort of see how they can be integrated with written archival sources. Yeah.
Thank you.
So instead of following on this, has anybody come forward between the documentary and the book to identify themselves as the family of a letter writer and even to offer to share sort of unredacted versions in case there had been modifications to it?
Yeah. So just before I left sort of the journalism board and switched to academia, I was able to air short pieces of just literally within the first few weeks of finding those letters in the TV channel I worked in. And we aired some stories relating to these letters. And yes, some people had come forward saying, you know, this is a letter that I've written or that a family member of mine that had passed away had written, etc. And we got to interview them. And that was really, really interesting. And not from 48 per se, but from later period into the 50s and 60s. And in the film itself, we go back to some of the letter writers and see how they relate today to some of the things that they had written in the past. And these are really sort of very emotional and very interesting ways, you know, in which people relate to what they had written, especially in the context of the first Palestinian Intifada, the first uprising, you know, where a lot of these soldiers, we have letters from these periods. These are soldiers that are, you know, are confronted with the reality of occupation and with, you know, in a very different ways than soldiers, let's say, fighting in 67 or 73. So they were reading some of those letters that they were writing in real time in their, you know, talking about how they were sent to beat up kids or stuff like that, and relating to some of these emotions, and that's part of the film. Yeah.
Yes, we have another question from the group, please.
Yeah, of course.
Thank you, Shay. So essentially, both your projects are essentially counter memory projects, right? And as a historian, you're working with official archives, or at least that's what the first book was about, and it seems like a lot of the second book is also about that. At the same time, the materials that you find in the official archives are the very personal, the very everyday, the very mundane ones. And I wonder a little bit about the tensions of working within the construct of an official archive, but working with the very personal narratives and the very personal documents. And at the same time, especially as you're moving towards the next project that you've been describing, about extending the work beyond the official archives. So finding materials in the less official, the more personal, the more perhaps even community sort of spaces. And that could include the interviews, but it could also include just finding more objects.
Yeah, thank you for this question. Yeah, it's been a very strange thing to look at the archives for something that would seem on first sight as something that doesn't, quote unquote, belong there. And so, you know, a lot of these letters, they were intercepted to get the state of mind of these people, but some of them were used for what I would say are nefarious means. For example, the letters of Palestinians in refugee camps after 1948-49, these letters often reveal the way that these Palestinians were trying to return to what had become Israel, go back to their villages, and actually expose these routes. Then those information was then conveyed to the border police that would ambush these people, right? So from information from the letter, and in fact, we know that from the end of the war in 49 all the way to 1956, between around 300,000 to 5,000 Palestinians were shot and killed as they tried to cross these borders. And so the letters are fascinating, heartbreaking. They tell about the emotion, the depression of the story of the Palestinian Nakba, but they're also, the state had also used them for intelligence, immediate purposes, including for the use of coercive force. And so it's always weird to know that tension. And also sometimes, you know, you see the letters and you read the analysis of those state officials who were tasked to analyze them. And, you know, oftentimes I'm like, that's what you got from there? I could read this in a very different way. And so what do you do with that, right? When, you know, I read the same sources or some of the same sources, and I analyze them in a very radical, different way compared to the way that those state officials tasked with actually reading and analyzing those letters did. And that is a very peculiar sort of reading against the grain notion that always, made me, at least when I was writing it, thinking of like, well, am I really a historian? Am I doing something else here? What is going on? And I think that has to do with some of the, I don't want to call it some of the conservative nature of the discipline, but I think it is in some ways that, right? Because that, it's always, the sources, they tell a story, but they also don't tell a story, right? They don't necessarily immediately lead you to, and so to take sources and to make them into a narrative is a process, and you need to sort of be careful not to be captive of the way the sources are presented to you. And it always reminds me that, for years I was searching for these letters of Arab volunteers and Palestinians from 1948. Couldn't find them. It was driving me crazy, and I knew it must exist, and it must be out there somewhere. Of course, not of course, but I ended up finding them in these archival files called uninteresting material, handwritten, throwaway. And it was like, all right, and that's where all these personal letters were in, right? And so, if you go by the logic of the archives, you get somewhere that is very different. And so that's something that's always important to remember, but not always easy to do. Yeah.
Any other questions from the floor here in Montreal, or any comments, questions from the Zoom?
Yeah.
Just one short question. How long did the project take, from the moment you heard about the first document until the book was there?
Oh, wow. So I found this in 2007. The book was published in 2021. So it took some time for sure. I'm hoping that with the second book, it will be a little bit of a shorter process. But it took some time for sure.
So we have a few minutes left, and rather than finishing early, let me close perhaps with a question. Now I'm not as an MC, but as a colleague and a scholar that I would like to tease you with, Shay. So the book tells and retells the 1948 War of Independence using revolutionary, very innovative methodology. The war was an international war. So a complete retelling of the story can only be possible if we could have access to similar archives, Egypt, Jordan, Assyria, and so forth. Is that at all possible? Are you aware of similar efforts by your colleagues in the Arab world looking for and sifting through this kind of material and information? And is there a way perhaps for an international consortium for historians such as yourself bringing this material to light and together?
Yeah, thank you so much for this. This is the question of sources is a really important one. Arab states today are largely authoritarian states in which, of course, information is banned and closed, and with the exception of some sources that are available in the Jordanian case and some selected scholars that the regime had approved that were available. So a lot of these sources, or I would say the majority, are not available with some exceptions. So for this book, I was able to get sources in Lebanon and in Iraq, actually. And I was very fortunate to be able to work with research assistants that were able to get some of these sources, and some of them are available. But by and large, they're not available. But what is interesting is that that's something I work on another aspect. Israel has taken over, looted, expropriated sources, not only from Palestinians in 1948, but on a much massive scale, also from Egypt and Jordan. And so there are tens of thousands of files in the Israeli archives that are actually Egyptian or Jordanian, and certainly from Palestinian institutions and individuals, etc. A lot of them are not open to the public, and that's something I've been struggling to get open, including with the help of some NGOs in Israel. And so a lot of these information but some of it is available for scholars. And I think that with pressure, etc., Israel. A lot of those stories about 1948, the state does not want to be revealed on the one hand, and certainly makes a concentrated effort to block access to these sources. On the other hand, Israel wants to present itself and its archival system as an archival system of a liberal democracy, and that's a tension, right? And so there's some things out there. There are many things that the state blocks, and I think that with pressure from scholars and around the world, we can see a lot more being opened up, hopefully not just in Israel, but elsewhere as well.
Thank you, Shay. So in closing, on behalf of the Concordia University Library and the Azrieli Institute of Israel Studies, I would like to once again congratulate Shay Hazkani, who is recipient of the second annual award for Best Book in Israel Studies. Shay, we are delighted that you accepted the invitation and you were able to visit us, and we certainly wish you a wonderful rest of your stay in Montreal. We picked together with you a lovely weekend. Certainly today is much nicer than the earlier part of the week was. And if, unless the weather forecasts were censored, which I don't think they were, we are going to see a little bit more sunshine this weekend. I would also like to thank Pat Riva, who took some very precious time away from her schedule to be with us. And of course, a very special thanks to you, Beth. It's wonderful to see you back here in political science. And thank you for coming over and representing the faculty and engaging both as a dean's representative, but also as a scholar with bringing the important question and perspective to the discussion. So thank you. Of course, none of our events, activities, especially those that are hybrid and online, would be possible without the able and skilled work and magic that is done by Corey Newman, a former student and current communications advisor. So, Corey, thank you once again for everything that you do. And friends, colleagues, thank you very much for showing up, visiting us here in person. And those of you who are joining us from different parts of the world on Zoom, we thank you for participating in this very important event today. We certainly hope that you will be joining us approximately this time next year, when we will be celebrating the presentation of the next third annual award for Best Book in Israel Studies. Ladies and gentlemen, I wish you all a lovely and beautiful weekend. Thank you.